Wait, not yet.
Good morning, all. My name is Margareta Dovgal, and I'm the Managing Director at ResourceWorks Society, a Vancouver-based nonprofit advocating for responsible natural resource development here in BC. Today's town hall discussion, Shifting Gears, Politics is Reshaping Energy and Electric Vehicle Policies, is going to be held in conversation with Barry Penner, King's Counsel. Barry is a former provincial cabinet minister, former MLA, of course. He has served in a variety of critical cabinet roles in the provincial government: Minister of Environment, Minister of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation, and Attorney General. As Minister of Environment, Barry was an advocate for small hydro, wind power, alternative energy sources. He was also part of the government that brought in the first carbon price in British, not only just in BC, but in North America. And after transitioning out of politics, after 16 years of public service, he started working in the private sector. And Barry is the chair of the Energy Futures Institute. It's an initiative the ResourceWorks was part of founding in December 2023. And that's where he continues to engage with the evolving energy landscape, emphasize practical and sustainable energy solutions. For today's town hall, we're going to be talking about the pivotal moment that we're in. We have very interesting things happening, not just trade relationships with our closest neighbor and trading partner, the United States, but also in the global landscape and geopolitically. There's federal EV rebates that ended abruptly just last month, and provincial incentives are facing uncertainty. The policy landscape is shifting very rapidly. So with affordability concerns rising, infrastructure challenges still unresolved, we're going to be asking some big questions, but I'd say the big one is whether BC's aggressive EV mandate is still achievable, given the current energy and economic realities. At this point, I'd like to pass it over to Barry. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Margareta. Good to be here. And thank you, everyone who's taken the time to zoom in to this meeting. As Margareta said, it's a very dynamic time. You don't have to hear that from me. We're all well aware of what's happening. There's a major disruption taking place globally, much of it driven from the Oval Office, but not only there. There's many other forces at play. Just to remind everyone about here in British Columbia, what are those mandates that Margareta just mentioned and whether they're achievable? British Columbia has, by most measures, the most aggressive EV mandates established in law in North America and perhaps the Western world. Except for perhaps Norway, and we'll delve into Norway a bit more later. So what are the numbers in BC that we're legally mandated to achieve? 26% by the 2026 model year. Now, I'll just pause here to note that all of these dates indicate, a calendar year, but those vehicles, the model years, tend to start arriving 6 to sometimes 8 months before the actual calendar year. So for British Columbia, the 26% requirement for 2026 is the model year, and already there are some 2026 models arriving. The significance of that, Margareta, is that the penalties and so forth under BC legislation start to apply to the models that are arriving that are designated 2026 model year. So in fact, that 26% requirement's already starting to have an effect, and I'll talk about that in a moment, about what the consequences are. 90% by the 2030 model year, which sounds like 5 years out, but again, those models start arriving up to 8 to 9 months before. So really, we're about 4 years now out from where the 90% requirement bites. And that is a number that most people overlook, especially in the media. They tend to focus on the 100% requirement by 2035, because that's what, as you can see below, that's what the federal mandate is. It's 100% by 2035 and only 60% by 2030, compared to British Columbia's 90%. So here in the province of British Columbia, you can see we have set a much more ambitious timeline. Compare that in the United States, and in fact, the 67% number by 2032, although it's been characterized by President Trump as a mandate, it's actually more of a target. It's not really enforceable, as I understand it, not in the way that British Columbia has imposed penalties. And then for California, you can see their target for 2030 is 68%. Again, significantly less than what British Columbia has set at 90%. So how are we supposed to achieve some of this? Governments recognize that a transition to this different technology for personal automobiles is challenging and financially costly. A typical electric vehicle costs more than a comparable internal combustion engine, the traditional vehicles. So the federal government launched a rebate program way back in 2019 already with $300 million initially set aside. That money got depleted. Additional funds were allocated. You can see another 287 million in 2020. There have been additional amounts along the way, and then it abruptly came to a screeching halt, pun intended, I think on January 13th or so, with almost no warning. The funds were gone. It had been expected that they would last until the end of March, and the government would have time to pass a budget and perhaps reallocate some funds. However, that has not happened, and now, of course, the Parliament's prorogued. There's serious doubt we'll have a budget anytime soon, given the state of federal politics. I won't get into that, but anyway, lots of question marks about what's going to happen at federal rebate. All told, it's estimated that up to $3 billion Canadian funds have been spent by the federal government on various rebate and incentive programs. That's an estimate as of this year, before the money ran out, about $3 billion. On the right-hand side, you see what BC's put on the table, and they've been refining it somewhat. And so even just last June, just before a weekend, the government revised the program, which had the effect, according to the New Car Dealers Association in British Columbia, of taking about 75 to 80% of the electric vehicles off the table in terms of being eligible for the rebate, because it set a maximum price of $50,000. Most EVs cost more than $50,000 and therefore don't qualify for the BC government rebate. Although on paper, it's up to $4,000, but again, that's only if the EV is under $50,000, and there's only a handful that are. And then it's also income tested. So if your income is, I think, $90,000 or $100,000 or over per year, you are no longer eligible for the rebate. So it's become more challenging. And then you can see, again, some of the numbers here about the total dollars spent. And again, it doesn't capture the total. There's more public funds being spent, for example, on electric charging stations. We haven't itemized those costs, but those initiatives obviously cost money, and they come from taxpayers. Taking a look around the world, there is a clear connection between the end of government-funded or taxpayer-funded rebates and incentives and EV sales. We'll get to, you can see it down at the bottom, EV Tesla sales plunged in Europe. In Germany, it's been heavily reported about a major drop in EV sales. But you can see there's other things happening. Just yesterday, this news story came across my wire from Reuters. Nikola goes bankrupt. That was a hydrogen fuel cell and electric truck manufacturing business, I think in Arizona. Had a lot of public profile, and they filed for bankruptcy. And the CEO says, we've done our best, but unfortunately we just can't do it. And so the curtain is dropping on that company. There's been other battery manufacturers fail over the last number of months. So there's a lot of stress in the manufacturing side of this, in the various parts of the supply chain. Here's kind of a breaking story in Canada, and this proves the point that as rebates end, so do EV sales, or at least there's a significant restriction or contraction in sales. You see that, yes, Tesla sales were down about 70%, but overall EV sales in Canada were down by even more. So if you've brought in other manufacturers into the picture, they dropped by about 79%. That includes plug-in hybrids as well as full EVs. So again, a clear connection. So what happened is in Quebec, they've suspended temporarily at least their provincial rebate program, which was the most generous in Canada, up to $7,000 on top of the $5,000 you could get from the federal government. Their provincial government telegraphed about this time last year that they'd start scaling it back. It was going to go down a couple $1,000s per vehicle at the end of December. And so that led to a bit of a rush in the fall of people in Quebec, I think, purchasing and bringing forward their decisions to get that provincial rebate, the maximum. But then what happened, January comes along, and I'm not sure exactly why, but the provincial government of Quebec has suspended the program completely. They're not saying it's forever, but at the moment, the provincial rebates have been suspended. And then the federal rebate program, dried up on January 13th as well. So I think that overall contributes to the 79% reduction that we've seen in EV sales in a short period of time here in Canada. I mentioned again of what's happened in Germany. Let's go into a bit more detail here. A 27% drop in EV sales in 2024 after the German government significantly scaled back EV incentives, citing a budget crisis. So many countries in the world are grappling with a wide variety of financial and economic challenges. There's some storm clouds on the horizon. And one of the things that seems to go are the financial incentives for electric vehicles. You can see in the UK, there had been significant growth in EV market share, and then that stagnated and flatlined around the time that EV subsidies or grants got suspended there in the UK. Other countries are doing the same thing. We don't have it here on this slide, but in France, there's also been a significant drop, I think somewhere in the order of 60% down in a short period of time. So again, as governments face financial pressures, competing demands for limited dollars, debt servicing problems, EV subsidies seem to be on the chopping block. One of the exceptions may be Norway, and this is often held up as a country that British Columbia should aspire to emulate. It's roughly the same size in terms of population, also has a significant large-scale hydroelectric kind of backbone to their electricity generating system, although it's meeting its limits too. They've had drought as we've had, and they've been, to some extent, importing power from various parts of Europe, which has caused some controversy and prompted their finance minister to resign in January, citing the government's electricity policy. There could be other things at play there, but the coalition government's on shaky ground. And one of the issues is their electricity policy. However, they did announce that in January, they managed to attain about 96% of all new car sales being EVs. That doesn't mean that today there's 96% electric vehicles on the road. In Norway, it's about 25 to 30%. Because, of course, people are holding on to their internal combustion engine vehicles for a period of time. But this goal, notable as it is, did not come for free. The estimate is that the government has spent about $5 to $6 billion Canadian equivalent per year in order to make this happen, with significant subsidies or rebates per vehicle up to $20,000 Canadian for small EVs and $38,000 for larger EVs. And again, so as much as, in Canada, we had our $5,000 rebate until the money ran out. That was small potatoes compared to what Norway was putting on the table and still is. One of the interesting things that's quite startling is the increase in total number of vehicles registered. The total number of vehicles in Norway has gone up by 70% since 2015, and the population's only grown by 5% at the same time. What seems to have happened is people have taken the government money and the other perks that come with being able to use bus lanes if you have an EV and not have to pay ferry tolls or bridge tolls, and you could park in places other people couldn't park if you had an EV. So there are all these other kind of non-direct financial incentives. So people have said, okay, we'll buy an EV, but they kept their internal combustion engine vehicle. And so many people have just picked up an extra vehicle. And that's why you see there's been a significant increase in the number of personal automobiles. And this has prompted a new debate in Norway. Have they maybe gone about this the wrong way? What happened to focusing on mass transit? What about buses? What about subways? What happened? Was really the goal to just have more personal vehicles? Obviously, no. The goal was to reduce emissions, but they've ended up with a lot more personal vehicles. And yes, they're electric, but even in the manufacturing process of EVs, there's significant greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. So it does beg the question, what is the ultimate objective? Is it more personal automobiles, or is it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And I think there's going to be some reevaluation of exactly what the specific policy measure should be.
Can I jump in with a question on this, Barry?
Yes.
So the goal has been to reduce emissions, try to decouple growth, economic growth, population growth from emissions growth. I don't know if we have the numbers in front of us, but what's your impression of whether it's had that effect? You've talked about some of the unintended consequences, but has Norway made progress as a result of what is, from the sounds of it, the most ambitious policy on EV adoption in the world?
Overall, they've made progress on reducing emissions. I think more than Canada has. The query is how much of that is related to electric vehicles versus other measures in their economy. As you know, much of the money that they're using, of course, to fund these subsidies come from fossil fuel development. They have a very large and significant offshore oil industry in Norway, which has created I think, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, hundreds of billions of dollars, US, and actually maybe more than that. And that's helping fund various social programs in Norway, as well as this initiative around EVs. So it's hard to untangle all of the details, and that's could be the focus of a future webinar, just to peel back the onion a bit.
Absolutely. Thank you for answering that question. And just a reminder to everyone, we will be having a Q&A. So if you haven't had a chance to already see the note that we put into the chat, definitely start getting your questions into that Q&A box. We will be tackling as many of them as we can after Barry's done his presentation.
So these competing priorities and changing trends that we've seen in Europe with countries scaling back EV subsidies, again, that's coming in our direction. And we've already seen money run out, at least for now, at the federal level. In Quebec, it's been suspended. In BC, it's been pruned back. And there have been questions about whether BC will maintain their current reduced amount of financial incentives for EVs here in BC. I know CBC News has been asking the Ministry of Energy, which now has responsibility for the program in BC, whether they will refund or keep the program going. And they have not been able to get an answer. Yesterday, we had a throne speech, the first speech from the throne by the government since the election in the fall, and I could find no reference to greenhouse gas reduction targets or to the electric vehicle program, which is quite a contrast to previous throne speeches here in BC in recent years, where much was said about efforts to adopt electric vehicles and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it appears that their changing priorities are happening not just in Canada, but also here in British Columbia at the government level, if the speech from the throne is any indication. And it remains to be seen again. We'll have a budget relatively soon, just how much money is actually allocated, if any, for continuing EV rebates and building out the EV infrastructure. Of course, I mentioned earlier the cost of public charging stations. According to the BC government's own objective, they want 40,000 public charging stations by 2030. But at last count, we're somewhere around 5,500. So many times more are required to hit the government target of 2030 at a significant cost. And Professor Jerome Gesaroli released a report on this for Energy Futures last April. And he quantified those numbers and broke down the true costs. And I don't have those here, but they're on our website, and encourage our viewers to download Professor Gesaroli's report if you're interested in diving into that a bit more. But without the charging stations, many people are reluctant to make the switch because of range anxiety. It's one thing if you have a detached single-family home and you can plug in at night. Many people, especially in urban settings, don't have that luxury. They live in a multi-unit dwelling as a townhouse or a condominium, and many of those are not equipped to have everyone plug in their vehicle overnight. So that means public charging stations become a priority, and that costs money. Anyway, just taking a look at some of the shifting issues in Canada, and again, we've talked to many of these already. And at the bottom line there is, the climate goals that we've heard about much in the past seem to be challenged when they run into economic reality. I was environment minister in 2008. We just introduced, Canada's most aggressive climate action plan. As Margareta mentioned, it included a broad-based carbon tax, which at the time was revenue neutral. It's not anymore. That's been changed by subsequent administrations, but at the time it was revenue neutral, and it was seen as world leading. And climate change and environmental issues were right at the top of the chart in public concern. And then came the world economic slowdown, credit markets froze, economies teetered into recession, And you can see in public opinion polls, public interest in the environment and climate change just fell off a cliff. And as environment minister, I was more than a little disappointed in that, quite frustrated. But it is the reality. People's priorities do change. And we're seeing that in Canada. New Angus Reid poll out this week tested people's opinions on different topics, and interest in the environment has dropped. Concern around employment, federal deficits, job creation, tariffs, all of those matters have gone to the top. Similar to what happened in 2008 with the world economic slowdown, the global slowdown. So I think we're seeing a bit of history repeating.
Absolutely. That explains a little bit as well, like why governments that are committed to acting on climate change make such a priority of moving quickly when times are good. There is the fiscal capacity to support incentives and subsidies and other programs. There's the public will component as well. But then, of course, you have the corollary when things are not as promising. There's uncertainty, whether it's geopolitical or economic uncertainty or both. You kind of see it go in the opposite direction, both in the polling and in turn government responses.
Yes, and it'll be an interesting debate. What comes first? The government's genuine concern about their fiscal state and how much they're red ink they're running, or is it just public opinion?
Yeah.
What do they concern themselves about more? I guess it depends maybe on the political party of the day that's in power, but clearly we've got both things happening. In British Columbia, $9.4 billion deficit after just a few years ago having a $5 billion surplus. So we're clearly into the red ink territory, but the public at the same time, their priorities have shifted to other things. And I think that's reflected in the throne speech yesterday. So, what to do about this? As we suggested in our report last year that Professor Jess-Rowley wrote, there's some changes that could be made. And currently, the government policy is very prescriptive. It must be an electric vehicle. No discussion about hydrogen in terms of vehicles being adequate. And I know they have technological challenges, but this idea of government being prescriptive and picking the technology that must prevail, the history is littered with bad outcomes there. So we have suggested looking at the outcomes. If you want to reduce emissions, let's make that the target and leave it to industry and consumers to figure out what they prefer is the way to get there. Deviating somewhat from our slide here, but there's been huge success in improving the efficiency of existing internal combustion engines. Just last year, the new Toyota Prius set a new world record, Guinness Book of World Record, for getting 93 miles per gallon average, going across from, I think they drove from Los Angeles to New York. And on that trip, averaged 93 miles per gallon. Now, the driver made an effort to do that. And that's not the EPA rating, but this was verified as an actual result in the real world with significant effort. But this person was able to achieve 93 miles to the gallon. So technology, and that was a hybrid vehicle, not full electric, just a traditional hybrid vehicle that Toyota sells and anyone can purchase at a cheaper price than a full EV. So it's just an example of how technology can improve with existing formats. And it's easier for the consumer to adopt. Don't need the public charging stations, exactly. Anyway, so some recommendations here. I think it's obvious that we will not attain our 90% objective for EV sales in British Columbia. I don't think we'll hit our 26% target for the 2026 model year. EV sales in BC were inching towards that in 2024 until the provincial government started to pull back on their incentives, and we started to see a softening in the fall in British Columbia of EV sales. And now the federal rebate money has dried up. And we see that story that was in the Toronto Star that nationally there's been a 79% drop in EV sales. That report did not break it out by province, but I expect that BC will not be immune to that significant drop. How long will that drop be in place? We don't know. But if you're asking me, will we hit our 26% target for the 2026 model year, which is actually this year because those models are arriving now? My answer is no, much less than 90% rebate. So what happens to manufacturers if they don't hit the existing rebate? That is in legislation. There's about a $20,000 penalty ultimately that will be assessed to the manufacturer per vehicle that exceeds the quota. And given the thin margins already and the challenge in the economy, I don't expect the manufacturers to eat that 20,000. They'll try to pass it on to the consumer or take steps to avoid it altogether. And what we're hearing anecdotally, manufacturers are already today in British Columbia starting not to move as many vehicles into the province for sale. They'll start to hold back to try and make sure that they don't get tagged with that $20,000 penalty per vehicle. And so that will reduce consumer choice. And as supply shrinks, basic economic tells you that if demand stays the same and supply shrinks, price goes up. So what we saw during COVID,
Yes.
right? The supply chain problems, there's less supply, prices went up for not just new vehicles, but then in the used market too, because the markets are linked. You can't afford a new one, you start chasing a used vehicle, and then that more demand for the used market pushes the price up. So that's the likely outcome if these policies are not relaxed in British Columbia, is higher prices for consumers, less choice, and even higher prices in the used car market, which will probably disproportionately hurt lower income people who can least afford to buy new vehicles or pay more for a used vehicle. Another thing that could be done is just review the cost efficiency of the current EV subsidies. And in other words, how much is it actually costing to get GHG reductions per ton for the amount of money spent on EV subsidies? Is there a way we could get bigger reductions at the same price or less price than subsidizing EVs? And this ties in with the third one, the massive subsidies that the federal government and provincial governments have signed on for manufacturing of electric vehicle batteries. Depending on the numbers, Canada's committed up to $30 billion, yes, with a B,
Wow.
towards EV subsidies for batteries. Now, some of that money won't get spent if the companies don't follow through and actually build the plants. But provinces have rushed into this as well, especially in Ontario and Quebec, but also in British Columbia. The provincial government was pleased to contribute money to a project in Maple Ridge. The Prime Minister came out here and joined Premier Eby to congratulate each other on supporting this investment in Maple Ridge. And now that company has announced they're not going forward with the project. And you're seeing other EV battery projects also falling off the table. Again, as the softening demand, or at least the slowing in demand, has been biting into projections. So these are all questions that many people had at the outset. Is it really wise to spend taxpayers' money gambling or betting on what the next technology will be? Or should we leave it up to the market?
Yeah. Or even the inverse, if you don't support through fiscal policies, industries that are maybe needed but risky, can you get those outcomes in other ways, or should you shift your focus sectorally? So, in the interest of transportation industry, emissions reductions, maybe you do need to spend money in some ways, but if you want to focus on emissions reductions elsewhere, it may actually be more cost effective to channel your money into completely different ways rather than, de-risking commercialization of tech that still isn't at that full commercialization without those massive supports.
And which technology? So the current technology in most electric vehicles, and it's a huge improvement over 10 years ago, it's lithium-ion batteries. My worry is that Canada's committed $30 billion for lithium-ion battery manufacturing facilities when the market's already moving towards solid state. Major companies such as Toyota and BYD in China and others and Hyundai are spending billions of dollars trying to prove out and commercialize solid state batteries to replace lithium-ion battery technology. So my worry is, yeah, we might get some battery manufacturing plants with significant taxpayer funding, but will we have built out-of-date technology by the time they actually are in operation? The market might have moved on to solid state if that can be commercialized. And I don't know, to be fair, I don't know how transferable in an existing lithium-ion factory that we might build in Ontario or Quebec, how transferable solid state technology would be to those manufacturing processes and plants. I don't know, but there certainly is risk involved whenever governments think they're picking a winner. It's quite often they get there a little bit too late. And then other industries are asked to, through their taxes, to subsidize these chosen industries. So many economists would say a better and more efficient approach and fairer approach is make your overall investment climate more attractive. Reduce red tape, reduce taxes across the board, but not just for a few chosen industries, but because that's, again, trying to pick a winner, and often government gets it wrong. So just make the playing field level and more competitive across the board, instead of, again, trying to guess what will be the prevailing technology.
And encouraging those who are willing to risk private capital to risk that private capital in an environment that is more permissive and, not permissive perhaps, but your odds of success might still be the same, but you're not having to deal with regulatory uncertainty to the same extent. You're not having to deal with high costs of compliance and armies of lawyers and engineers on issues that in other competitors' jurisdictions might not actually require the same sort of procedural investment from a private sector perspective.
Right. In other words, give the risk taker a better chance of getting a good return.
Yes.
By making a friendlier investment climate.
Yeah, and your results might
risk,
look different.
But if you do succeed, make sure there's a reward for that.
Absolutely. So I think at this point, we will be going to the Q&A, but just before we do that, we're going to very quickly advance a slide and give you a reminder. We have a great event coming up in Victoria for those of you that are in Victoria. Barry's actually going to be at that event, and we'll have some other speakers, Heather Exner-Perot from the Donald-Laurier Institute. Who are the other speakers? Remind me.
They don't have them currently in my head, but yes, you mentioned Heather will be there. We'll have a number of other speakers at the Ocean Point Hotel in Victoria on Tuesday, February the 25th, from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. You can come to our website or the ResourceWorks website, or go to Energy Futures, and you'll see information there about
we'll drop the link in the chat as well.
How you can get a link, or sorry, how you can get a ticket to attend the event.
Yeah, it'll be a nice lunch event and good discussion, chance not only to hear from Barry and others, but also to engage with the speakers directly and meet other attendees in Victoria who are interested in similar issues. So without further ado, we will be going to that Q&A portion. And we've had a really good number of questions pop in here. Keep submitting those, folks. There's been a really large number, so I'm going to try to synthesize a little bit. We've had a couple of questions, Barry, on relationship with China. I think one question was about tariffs, trade wars. What are the material impacts on Canadians from trade measures that are being taken by Canada and its allies? And then I think there was another question. Let me just quickly scroll through here. I think, so yeah, easing tariffs, would that allow for Chinese-made EVs to help us meet those 2030 targets? I suppose I would add, is that a good thing? And someone also asks, given that so much of that growth is happening as a result, that global transition in the types of vehicles that are being manufactured and then put on the road, it is being done by China. Is Canada being left behind potentially, or should we not be worried about that? A lot of questions there. See how you want to untangle those ones.
So the China EV versus tariff issue is maybe a microcosm of the challenge, the trade-off that I mentioned earlier. We see public opinion shift from concern about the environment to the economy. When the economy suffers or slows down, people become worried about their jobs and how they're going to make their mortgage payment, and so the economy rises to the top. Similarly, governments in Canada and the United States, even under the Democrats, they decided, I think, to prioritize industrial policy, i.e. the economy, over the environment and climate change, when they decided in lockstep to impose 100% tariffs against made-in-China electric vehicles. Those vehicles, why did the governments feel those tariffs were necessary? Because China was manufacturing EVs at such a cheap price that they would likely take up a big chunk of the market share in North America, hurting North American auto manufacturers. So the government put up a tariff wall, which made it more difficult for consumers to make the switch to electric vehicles, because the cheapest, and some would say some of the better performing electric vehicles now are made in China. BYD is just one of the brand names that's more recognized now, but there are many others that are being manufactured in China by different companies and selling at as much as, or as little as half the price of what we typically would see here in Canada. So if your ultimate goal was to reduce emissions through electric vehicle adoption, you would probably want more cheap electric vehicles available for consumers, so consumers would make that switch quicker. But we saw governments respond in the other direction with tariff walls, 100% tariffs, in order to protect the manufacturing base and jobs, some would say the economy in North America.
Well, it's actually, I see that's an echo of another question. And you're right, that is sort of the calculus that you have to do. Is it the affordability and the adoption by consumers of electric vehicles that you want, or do you want Canada to be in the supply chain? And I guess maybe a question to you, Barry, is should we be in that supply chain? You've spoken about our tendency to maybe inefficiently prioritize public resources for things that could be good bets, but could also not be. They could be placed on a technology that's no longer viable or necessary or preferred by markets. We have tendencies as well to focus on very specific outcomes at the expense of looking maybe at the broader investment climate and how we can not de-risk, but create an environment in which private capital is willing to take that risk. But do you feel like there is a role for Canada in the supply chain? Should we be prioritizing that as a goal in and of itself?
I think as an overall objective, Canada should hope to have or work to have a competitive economy that attracts investment in manufacturing and other industries as well. When Canada, federal government decided to embark on up to $30 billion in commitments for battery manufacturing for EVs. They did so in response to the federal government in the United States. The US government under President Biden had the Inflation Reduction Act, somewhat ironically named, that had lots of money allocated for things like subsidies and incentives for electric vehicles. And the Canadian government was worried that a big chunk of the Canadian auto manufacturing sector would start to drift south. And assuming that we're going to continue to have what used to be called the Auto Pact, and then the Free Trade Agreement, and then the US, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, to continue to allow the free movement of parts, auto parts back and forth across the border without tariffs, they thought, okay, we've got to stay in the game. Now that calculation has been upended, not only by this global shift in the EV market, but also by President Trump threatening to rip up effectively the agreement that he said himself was the best trade agreement in world history, the US, Canada, Mexico Free Trade Agreement that he insisted on in his first term. He's now saying, by imposing these tariffs, he's effectively, or saying he's going to impose tariffs, that would effectively abrogate that agreement that he himself signed just a few years ago and threaten Canada's participation in the integrated North American auto sector. So again, there's probably that move, if it were to happen, would again put further increase the chance that Canada's placed a bet that we're not going to be able to recover from in terms of the $30 billion.
That's a sizable concern. I want to change the topic a little bit to infrastructure, and I see there is a question here in the chat from Don Dalek. What are BC's energy supply projections, and will they accommodate the proposed increase in EVs? And that's Don's question. I know you've been doing a lot of media on this exact topic over the last year and a half, but I'm also going to put a small spin on it. These current mandates aside, which are very ambitious, there seems to be some cooling down and enthusiasm from different levels of government to maintain them, or at least allocate enough fiscal firepower to bring these adoption rates as high as they want. So if that's happening on the inverse, what do you expect the change to electricity demand in places like BC is going to be if we do actually scale back? Is it going to substantially change the fact, as you've mentioned many times, we're running out of electricity, or we will be soon? Or does it, come in as a drop in the bucket based on already there's some baseline adoption by consumers of EVs?
Depending on who you talk to, currently maybe 3 to 5% of vehicles on the road today in British Columbia are electric vehicles.
That's a small number, actually.
Right. So although about 20% or so of new vehicle sales in the last year have been electric vehicles, it takes time for the portfolio to change over, right? For the internal combustion engines vehicles to leave the road and end up in the scrapyard. So we're currently at about 3 to 5% EVs on the road. And so the amount of electricity they're currently consuming is relatively modest, maybe an average of 200 to 300 average megawatt hours, according to a report from BC Hydro about 18 months ago. However, according to Professor Jess Ciroli, if we were to actually meet BC's electric vehicle targets in their mandate in the legislation, by 2040, that would, and that sounds like a long ways out, but it's only 15 years, that would require 2 more Site C dams worth of electricity just for electric vehicles. And I mentioned 15 years sounds like a long time out, but the Site C dam, which is still not quite finished, was first announced in 2010, 15 years ago. So it's taken us 15 years to get to this point to build one Site C dam. If we were to really follow through with these EV mandates and have 100% electric vehicles, then by 2040, we need 2 more Site C dams in 15 years, and it took us 15 years to build one. And then there's the question, well, where would you have another dam, and would you have another dam? And that's a debate for another day. Short answer is probably not anytime soon, and not easily. So the government's pursuing wind power projects, and I think they've admitted through their haste, they're exempting them from environmental assessments and so on, that we really are in a bind. And that what I've been saying is, confirmed by government actions, if not words, which is that we are currently exposed in a very significant way. We've been importing, again, 2 Site C dams worth of electricity for 2 years in a row, 2023 and 2024. And we're continuing to import electricity today on a net basis from the United States and from Alberta. And again, we're facing the prospect of potentially damaging trade war. So I did shudder when I heard first Premier Ford and then echoed by Premier Eby threatening to cut off electricity sales in retaliation to any proposed US tariffs, because actually that would be pointing the gun at our own head, given that we're the ones that have been counting on imported electricity over the last few years to meet our domestic needs. Those 2 Site C dams worth of electricity amount to close to 20% of our domestic consumption. So without those imports, we would have been looking at severe curtailment, the kind of which we've never seen in British Columbia, with mandatory reductions in electricity consumption in order to try to keep the lights on.
It's brownouts, right? Effectively.
Yeah, there's different ways utilities can do it, but we've seen it in Alberta last year twice. Emergency notifications: turn off your TVs, turn down your heating, or else. And we saw the or else, and we saw some rolling blackouts in and around Edmonton and elsewhere in Alberta. They're short-lived, but it was in order to bring the electrical system back into balance. Yeah. It always has to equal, consumption has to equal supply in the electricity market. Bad things happen when you lose that balance.
And if you don't produce what you need domestically, you absolutely need to trade with other jurisdictions in order to make up the
And
delta.
I've never said the trade is a bad thing, but dependence is risky. And I've been saying that long before I thought President Trump was going to threaten tariffs on Canada and that somehow electricity trade could be compromised. That would be a very bad thing. Yeah. Many British Columbians are shocked to hear that we're now a net importer, because they remember 25 years ago when BC was selling electricity to California to help them when they were facing a crisis. And we profited handsomely from those electricity sales in the year 2000. Yes, we got stiffed for about $400 or $500 million. Many British Columbians remember that. What we forget is we cashed about $2 billion in checks before we did get the rest. So we did benefit significantly from that trade, and trade is a positive thing. But being dependent on it has its risks, as we're now realizing.
Absolutely. And a little bit of a follow-up on this, Rav Sultan was asking also about electricity generation, EV targets. He was wondering if you'd seen Professor Jacquard's recent story in the Vancouver Sun that we have lots of green, cheap electricity here in BC. Lots, maybe. I don't know. I haven't seen it. Have you seen the story?
I did see something by a former Deputy Minister of Environment, Mark Zacharias, had a piece from Clean Energy Canada saying, don't worry, everything's fine. We'll have enough electricity for all these targets. So I guess that's just a matter of opinion. I don't think, the targets are realistic. I just don't think, well, we've gone over that in detail. The market is moving away at the moment for EV sales. We saw a 70% drop apparently across Canada between December and January. So to hit the legislated targets in BC are dubious. And then the question is, will there be enough electricity? Well, I guess if you spend enough money, you could maybe do things. But the question is, where will that money come from?
Yes, that is the question. And we have
there's competing priorities, of course, healthcare, education, policing. Does anybody think that, our streets are safer than they were 10 years ago? No. So there's a big public appetite for more effort to improve public safety. So there's any number of competing demands for scarce tax dollars.
And as a former political decision maker, you know that balancing act. It's never going to be possible to do all the things we want to do. If we did, we wouldn't need to elect people to give us their version of what they think is needed to accomplish progress on the issues that people care about.
I lived the frustration of meeting with Treasury Board officials to argue for funds in the Ministry of Environment budget. And, you'd win some battles, but there's certainly be others you wouldn't win because other priorities.
So let's take this one a little bit higher level. We've had a number of really good questions in the chat about climate, and climate anxiety is something that I think, depending on what else is going on in the world, goes up and down. There's generational differences in how people worry about the future and what's to come. I studied climate policy and climate science and spent a lot of time really digging into not just what we feel like we know is happening, but what are the sources of uncertainty and where those impacts are going to be. You've mentioned those trade-offs and, wanting to find things that are cost effective, make the case from within government on why certain investments should be prioritized. What do you think BC's best play here is right now, given everything that's going on in the world? If it's not doubling down on EV mandates, where should the focus be going on acting on climate change in a way that actually makes sense?
I think there needs to be recognition that British Columbia is a very small player. We tend to sometimes overstate our importance. And of course, as a born and bred British Columbian, I'm proud of British Columbia, but when you travel internationally, you realize that, well, first of all, many people don't know we're here. And so we're a small population of about 5.5 million people out of a planet of 5 or 6 billion. So when you look at the numbers, if British Columbia were to stop emitting all greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, would the atmosphere notice? And according to numbers that have been crunched, we represent about 13/100ths of 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So an amount that would be made up by China in a few hours.
Wow.
If we were to completely cease to emit any. So it's not an argument for not doing our share, but it is a question about how much more than our share does it make sense for us to do, given that it's not going to move the needle in a substantial way forward from a global perspective. We need to keep our eyes on multiple issues at the same time. We have to maintain revenue to fund schools and hospitals and policing and public safety and roads and things, and to fight forest fires. And, people often say, well, look, we have the cost of forest fires, so we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Which is a bit of disingenuous way of suggesting that somehow if we did eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions from British Columbia tomorrow, we would save that money in fighting forest fires. No, because again, our contribution is so small, 13/100ths of 1%. The forest fire risk would remain the same. So we'd still have to continue funding and fighting forest fires and taking steps to try and mitigate the risk of wildfires in the future. So it doesn't square.
And how do you help people feel less powerless? Like I understand the psychology of that anxiety very, very well. Like I'm of a generation that has grown up hearing year over year, it's getting worse, it's getting worse, it's going to get very bad. And there's absolutely alarmism, but I think there's also things that are plainly obvious that we've been seeing, and you're right. It is very hard to make a meaningful impact. It does feel like a bit of a psychological safety blanket to say, well, I'm going to put all my pressure on my jurisdiction doing 150% of its fair share, and there goes my climate anxiety, just punt it onto this target, whether or not there's actually that impact. Can political communicators, can decision makers, can business leaders, you think, speak to the public in a way that is better and leads to better outcomes rather than sort of knee-jerk reaction policies that don't have good results at the end of the day, actually cost us money, reduce our ability to, fiscally support responses to climate change, and then also have, lots of other unintended consequences, but still make progress? Like, is there something that I'm missing here, or is this just accepting that there's going to be inherent limits to what jurisdictions like BC and Canada as well can actually do.
Yeah, again, it's the challenge of doing multiple things at the same time. And that means you can't do everything you want in any particular area because that would mean abandoning others. So the challenge is to try to maintain a functioning economy in Canada and British Columbia, while still, endeavoring to reduce our emissions where we can in a practical way. But coming up with artificial deadlines like 90% EV sales by 2030 I could see how it helps you get through an election cycle or maybe two, but then reality bites. And my worry is that ultimately the public becomes jaundiced and skeptical of any efforts because they'll see governments setting these targets, saying it's going to be done, and then it's not done. And it leads to a demoralization. So I'm not saying be demoralized. I just mean, let's be realistic and have an honest conversation with British Columbians that we're not going to go to zero emissions. We're not likely to get to zero by 2050, barring some major technological breakthroughs with carbon capture, for example, and sequestration, which many environmental groups are opposed to, but which really are probably the only way you're going to really make a serious reduction in the time period required. Certainly try to, the talk around net zero. That means you're going to have to find a way to take carbon out of the atmosphere because we're still going to need to produce or emit GHGs in the manufacturing process of various things that we use every day, from these laptops to your home that you're living in, to the vehicles or buses or SkyTrains that you're riding.
Absolutely. No, thank you. That was a really, really good answer. And, a bit of a shot of sobriety at this time of day is not always wanted, but it's probably needed. I want to do a little bit of rapid fire on getting back into EVs. And as you do that, I encourage anyone here to please share any final questions you have, throw them in the chat, and we'll see if we can get to them in a way that naturally weaves through different themes that have been popping up. I think I want to talk a little bit about consumers who have bought electric vehicles. Barry, do you have any advice to people who have made this decision? Does change in the political climate, the future of EV mandates and incentives for adoption, does that affect sort of their household level case, or are they okay, and irrespective of what happens?
Well, I salute people who have made that choice. EV technology is amazing. It's fun. Let's not forget that. That instant torque off the line is hard to replicate with any other vehicle, and then to do it silently is amazing. So I'm not here to besmirch the technology. Far from it. It does represent, in my view, a significant advance, but it doesn't work for everyone and not for every application. And there needs to be a recognition of that and some patience for those people that are nervous about making change. And again, like I said, not everyone lives in a single family detached home. Not everyone can afford the cost of purchasing an electric vehicle. Although I will say the price of used electric vehicles, particularly Teslas, seems to be dropping quickly. Speaking from someone I know personally that recently, out of protest against Elon Musk's involvement in the current US administration, felt compelled to unload their Tesla. The price for used Teslas has been definitely dropping. But anyway, there are more opportunities, I guess, coming to purchase electric vehicles in the used market at a reasonable price. And again, if you can make it work for your lifestyle, it is a fascinating technology. And again, the quietness and the torque is impressive. And again, there are the emission reduction benefits. So even in BC, even though we're importing electricity from the United States and from Alberta, still overall, I believe that there is a net environmental benefit in terms of GHGs operating on an electric vehicle in BC compared to an internal combustion vehicle. But the equation gets a bit murkier the more that we import electricity, and also depending on the manufacturing that goes into that vehicle and how the vehicle is used.
And a couple of other clarifying rapid fire questions here. Someone asked earlier, slide about EV rebates, that BC rebates are ending on March 31st. Is that correct?
Well, the government has said that they're committed to that to March 31st. And I think Minister Dix, the new energy minister, is saying that all programs are under review. And the government's always looking to make sure, they're getting value for money. So I don't know how to decode that. That leaves the question mark, will it be refunded? My understanding is that, in fact, government's moved that off book in a way that they put the cost onto BC Hydro, and BC Hydro had been funding those rebates by selling renewable electricity certificates into the California market. But that money's dried up because we haven't been selling electricity as much into the California market. Our imported electricity exceeded our exports by 8 times.
Wow.
So in other words, we're importing 8 times more electricity than we're exporting over the last year or two. So my guess would be that the revenue source that BC Hydro was counting on to in turn help the government pay for these rebates is seriously limited. So what will make up the difference? I don't know. More borrowed money? I don't know.
We shall see, I suppose. And then I have a final question that I think will tie it all together really nicely. And then we'll just get a chance to, get these. I think we're sending out these slides. Yes, maybe no. Yeah, big thumbs up over from behind the camera. So we'll be sending these in case you have any additional follow-up questions. As always, be sure to check out our website, Energy Futures Institute, and we have a lot of really good materials there, including that report by Jerome Gisaroli. So final question for you here, Barry. Where does BC fit into the future energy needs of Canada? That comes from Bruce Rosenhart.
Well, we have a tremendous range of different energy sources in British Columbia. The question is whether we're going to tap them. For example, we do, I believe, have uranium resources. Usually you think of Saskatchewan because they're developing and exploiting those resources, but in British Columbia, there is the potential for uranium extraction, but currently it's prohibited by law. And then, of course, we've got copious quantities of natural gas, some oil. We have wood fiber, although the forest industry's, seriously hurting these days. And then, of course, we have our electricity system. But it's worth mentioning that much as we talk about electricity in British Columbia, it only represents about 17% of our total energy consumption. In other words, 83%, if you're thinking of it as a pie, 83% of our energy needs are met by things other than electricity. So electricity is just less than a fifth of our total requirements. And yes, there's more that we're doing in terms of developing some wind power projects and other things, but overall, we have many other options. A lot of discussion about should there be more of an east-west grid in Canada. We have strong connections south, but our interconnection in British Columbia to the United States is about 3 times larger in terms of capacity than it is to Alberta. And that's just a historical fact. And that's often the case when you look across the country. The connections between Ontario and the United States are greater in capacity than they are between Ontario and Quebec.
Yeah, I mean, this whole trade war has been a reminder to look at not just our relationship internationally across that Canada-US border, but to also look at things like interprovincial trade barriers and, as you're saying, interprovincial electricity interties. So yeah, that's a really, really good reminder. Any final thoughts on some of the policy conclusions we've shared during this town hall, Barry? Things that you just hope stick in the minds of those who have the ability to make a change?
Think about being practical and think about having, as I like to say, we like to say here at Energy Futures, to have an adult conversation with people. Be realistic and level with people that, the 90% target for EVs is just not going to happen. And I think the sooner we kind of acknowledge that, the better off we will be, because there are going to be increasing costs, I think, even starting this year, due to the 26% requirement for the 2026 model year. And we'll have those extra costs being imposed on British Columbians at a time they already are facing a cost of living crisis. And it's just not going to actually result in that percentage of EVs being on the road.
Thank you so much, Barry. This is a great conversation. Thank you for joining us from afar. And be sure to check your email after this conversation, because we will be sending around a link for the Victoria event coming up on Tuesday, February 25th. And that'll be on energy choices for a secure future between ResourceWorks, Energy Futures Institute, and the Macdonald Laurier Institute. Thanks so much for your time. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.